Welcome to DeProgram. I'm Michelle Witte. I am joined by John Kiriakou and Ted Rall, and we are also joined today by Nick Cleveland-Stout of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Thanks for joining us, Nick.
Great to be here. Thanks for the invite.
So we are having this conversation because earlier this month, the Quincy Institute produced something that I guess no one had really bothered to do before, with a little asterisk there. But you guys produced a publicly available repository of U.S. think tank funding. And we want to talk about why that matters and maybe a little bit why it hadn't happened until now. And so if you will bear with me, I want to give listeners a few highlights of what you and your co-author Ben Freeman found before we get into some questions. So I'll lay out some of the highlights here. You guys undertook a review of think tank funding and transparency, and I think unsurprisingly for people paying attention, you found a lot of potentially shady collaboration going on and a lack of transparency in the sector. Of the top 50 think tanks in the country, you found only 20% were fully transparent with regard to their funding. A plurality were only partially transparent, and 36% provide almost no information about where their funding comes from. Then where you were able to track funding, you found that 65% of think tanks took some kind of foreign government funding. 62% took funding from Pentagon contractors. So we're thinking of Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, the contractor formerly known as Raytheon, which is now RTX, some others that get less attention like Mitsubishi. And of course, all of these figures that you found are probably actually higher because you're only looking at funding from relatively transparent think tanks. And also because I guess different entities have their own different little caveats, and some of them are, we'll publish donors, but we don't publish corporate contributions. And so I guess rather than ask you to start by saying, why does this matter? Because you laid it out in the piece, these think tanks are supposed to produce independent analysis that the government can draw upon to make policy. And if they're being funded by entities that stand to gain or lose from these policies, there is, of course, huge potential for conflicts of interest. But what grabbed me on this topic in the piece is that you draw on some previous studies about think tanks. And in your piece for the Quincy Institute, you pulled a quote from a study from a couple of years back in which a think tank scholar said, self-censorship is the greatest threat to our democracies in the West. A lot of think tank experts posture as experts with complete academic freedom, and this is absolutely not the case, which is pretty dramatic. So, Again, if you think that recap is basically accurate, I was wanting to kind of start there. If you can take us down this path from Northrop Grumman, for example, is pouring money into think tanks to we're at the end of democracy in the West.
For sure. There are a few different avenues of influence that donors are seeking and investing in think tanks, right? And I think the one you mentioned, self-censorship, that's the biggest one. The fact that there is this kind of chilling effect across a think tank that is receiving funding from one of these sources, be it depending on a contractor or a foreign government. And the reason that it matters is because think tanks have a lot of say in influencing policy. They are not only quoted, the experts that are quoted most frequently by media on defense policy, but they're also frequently testifying to Congress in front of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Armed Services Committee. So what they say, and they're also serving on a lot of commissions. The National Defense Strategy Commission, the Strategic Posture Commission. These are congressionally created commissions that analyzed either defense policy or nuclear weapons posture and try to advise Congress and posture what the future of defense policy should be. So they have a lot of say, and so the reason that funding matters is precisely as you mentioned, that self-censorship. And there are other avenues of influence, and in some cases we can even find there are a few examples where there is even more overt instances of censorship, or pay-to-play research, corporate sponsorship programs. And so there's a lot of ways in which donors can exercise this kind of influence. But it is usually this sort of implicit influence, it's understated. It's not this like big conspiracy where they're doling out this money and then telling people what to say and think, usually, right? There are some instances of that, but it's usually the understanding, implicit understanding that the scholarship will reflect the recommendations or the desires of the donor itself. And so that influences our democracy, right? Since these players have a pretty outsized influence in our system.
Can you give us a little bit about how that influence manifests itself? I worked briefly at a think tank once that took no corporate funding, and they were so thrilled when they saw on C-SPAN a member of Congress just holding one of their reports. They actually threw a party at the end of the week. They were so happy. And I know that that's not the norm. So how can we gauge the success that these think tanks are having in terms of, let's say, legislation or more broadly policy?
It's a really tough, it's a great question, and one that like we went back and forth with a lot in trying to answer. And ultimately, to be quite frank, like we didn't really try to answer that exact question in the report and database. We wanted this to be a tool for other people to kind of latch onto, and come to their own conclusions, follow the money with. But I think in part it is difficult to apply some sort of like quantitative metric. Like you can go into you can see how many congressional letters a think tank signed on to. You can see how many times they testified in front of Congress. That's one that I typically like to go to because that's a very tangible effect. And I can tell you the numbers for that. CSIS is the think tank that has the most influence there, followed by several dark money think tanks, AEI, Foundation for Defense of Democracies. But yeah, ultimately that line from the money leaving the donor's pocket and entering into the think tank's revenue, and then recommendations, it's a tough one to follow. And so you kind of have to parse it out for yourself. And the biggest I think metric that you can look to see if it's working or not is if you look at to see if a donor continues to give money to that think tank or not. If a donor still believes that it's in its interests to donate to a given think tank, and they do kind of follow typically this sort of I liken it to I don't gamble or go to casinos, but I think it's called like the block bet for roulette, where you just make these massive bets on a bunch of different numbers, or an outside bet, I think it's called. And that's kind of akin to what they're doing, right? They're investing in a bunch of think tanks. And if a think tank, they don't believe at a certain point that it's not a good investment, maybe they'll decide to pull funding. More often than not, though, that's not the case.
Is it, at the risk of sounding like a Pollyanna, are there any of these donors who just kick money in and don't expect anything in return? They just do it to be nice?
It's possible. It's entirely possible, right? Like we don't know the terms of agreement. Maybe the UAE, just out of the goodness of their hearts, really wants to give $16 million to think tanks across DC, because they believe in this concept of a university without students, which is kind of like the model that think tanks used to follow, in which they would receive funding from wealthy philanthropists. And there are certainly critiques of that model, but it did used to operate fairly objectively and independently. but that's just given the funding model today, I think it's much more likely that they're avenues for influence. And I think the think tank donors themselves have even said as much. We are not the first person, we are not the first organization to lead an investigation into think tank funding. And the New York Times, I think they were sort of the first major publication, at least in recent years, to do this about 10 years ago now. And one of the quotes from that write-up that they had was a quote from a foreign government that said, and this was internal, it was not meant to be public, that investing in think tanks is a very good avenue for influence. And so the fact that donors are saying this themselves gives us some pause that, okay, they're probably not just doing this to be nice for the, furthering research. I think in the case of especially corporate donors, there definitely are some instances in which they are really just out to an extent outsourcing research. Like they want people who are genuine subject area experts to see if something is feasible. But the fact that this is all public facing at least implies that there is sort of a dual use to that, right? That they're also getting really good publicity for things that they're either considering doing or already doing. And so that influences kind of the discourse around these think tanks.
I want to ask about some of the more like explicit pay to play offers, but since the New York Times came up, I was thinking, how would you track the effectiveness or the impact on democracy of some of these think tanks? And I suppose one way you could do it is like, keep track of public opinion versus the actions of our legislature, right? But of course, that has to be, that's complexified by the fact that these think tank white papers and experts and whatever are not just testifying before Congress, they're writing, they're being called upon as experts by the media, they're writing op-eds and whatever. And so I wanted to ask, like, why has it come to a think tank itself, the Quincy Institute, which you included in this report and, gave a 4 out of a 5 scale on transparency. Why has it come to you to do this? Shouldn't this have been somebody else's job, right? And I'm thinking, of course, like, shouldn't the media aren't they supposed to be the guardians of our democracy? Shouldn't they have been on this before the industry, someone in the industry is attempting to, regulate or not regulate, but, make itself more transparent?
100%. Think tank funding is something of a third rail in Washington. Like, it can kind of show you where a think tank's priorities are, but no one really talks about it so openly. And we honestly, I think the number one reason we did this project is for what you mentioned is the media. Because think tanks are not going to simply acknowledge these conflicts of interest themselves, right? It's not really in their interest to do so. But the media, which is inviting think tank experts to give quotes for reports, give interviews on TV, all these things. They rarely mention these kinds of conflicts of interest. And sometimes, there's okay reason for that, right? Like I think it's almost difficult to kind of quantify the or single or zero in on a single conflict of interest. Like I've been going through these witness disclosure forms for Congress, truth and testimony forms, and most witnesses avoid disclosure, but then some like acknowledge all of their conflicts of interest, and at that point, it's like there's almost too many that it's hard to parse out what matters and what doesn't. And so I think the media I think some good faith actors in the media probably find themselves in a similar bind, but a lot just also don't do it because it's uncomfortable too, right? Like these are sources, and there's this idea that by mentioning those conflicts of interest, that there is an implicit questioning of the independence of the analysis being produced. And I don't think that should necessarily be the case. I think people can make arguments about it for particular folks or recommendations or funding relationships. But I think if we want to foster a better culture around disclosing these conflicts of interest, then I think we need to have those front and center. And you know, the New York Times, since we're talking about them, they actually did have a report earlier this year, at least one, or sorry, last year now, in which they did mention that a think tank scholar was receiving funding from the Gulf in an interview about kind of foreign policy analysis about Iran, I believe it was. And so that's exactly the kinds of things that we want to encourage with this.
Do you think that in an ideal world, if there was more awareness about these revelations about who's funding what, that it might change behavior and make some think tanks less likely to accept donations at all, or to be, you know, maybe more judicious or careful about who they accept money from?
Yeah, I think so. You know, there are some instances of that already happening where, you know, these funding relationships coming to light has led some think tanks to sort of reevaluate the relationships. I think one big one was after the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. There was this sort of come to Jesus moment in Washington where, you know, people looked around and they're like, oh, you know, a lot of these places are receiving a lot of Saudi funding. This seems like an issue. It could be a PR problem for a given think tank. So some think tanks, at least momentarily, cut ties. But you know what happens when that public pressure isn't applied anymore, and people are turning the other way. A lot of think tanks started to accept funding from Saudi sources again. I think another big one was the Brookings scandal with Qatar. There was this, you know, the director, President John Allen, he was under FBI investigation for lobbying for Qatar, which was giving exorbitant amounts of money to Brookings, which is one of the oldest and most prestigious think tanks in Washington. And since that scandal, the charges were dropped, then Brookings has not, as far as I know, taken a cent from Qatar. So I think it is reasonable to think that, you know, when, you know, we want to make this database public for people to do with it what they want, follow the money. And so when journalists start to do that, as we've already seen happen, we've seen a lot of people engage with this project, then I think you know, it can let the public kind of judge for itself. You know, should a think tank be put under scrutiny for a given funding relationship or not?
I want to ask also, I mean, I want to make sure that we get to Pentagon contractors as well as foreign governments. But, you know, and as you say, a lot of this influence or potential influence is not explicit. And, you know, it just comes in concerns about funding and institutions wanting to, you know, maintain themselves and be self-perpetuating. But you also do highlight in this report some pretty explicit offers of, you know, of influence. And I wanted to ask about some of that. And like, I don't know, you make some recommendations also in the piece that the FARA language, the Foreign Agents Registration Act, be made more precise or offer more clarity around when think tanks should potentially register as lobbying activities. Because you have like the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, which doesn't publicly disclose information about donors, but it advertises that if you give the organization more than $25,000, you will get unique opportunities to access our work, invitations to intimate regional events, private dinners, and special visits to key policy venues in Washington. The Wilson Center, for a certain fee, will give you opportunities to host intimate and private salon discussions with senior level program directors on issues of interest and private off-the-record events around the country. And the Atlantic Council offers its strategic partners private dinners, briefings, and in general, a deeply collaborative relationship, which I mean, that, I don't know how much that differs from what we'd think of as lobbying, right? And so I'm sort of curious, like, I don't know, in putting together this piece, like, did you and your co-author think this is explicitly within the definition of lobbying? How is it that they are getting a carve out? Or like, what could be what could be done with the notoriously vague language of Farah to try to regulate this? Because it does seem like they're just kind of gerrymandering around the definition of lobbying here.
Yeah, they definitely do. It's sort of yeah, they dance around it a lot. And you know, there's this. So these are what you mentioned. These are called corporate sponsorship programs, and most major think tanks in DC have them. Some sort of explicit but nebulous avenue for influence that serves as a an advertisement to donors. And yeah, you're exactly right. A lot of donors even give to think tanks precisely because, as you mentioned, it's unregulated. You know, under FARA, think tanks have to disclose, or sorry, lobbyists have to disclose all sorts of things. You know, they have to disclose who they're contacting. They have to disclose what's called informational materials, which are basically these you know, one-pagers that are disseminated on Capitol Hill and to media. They have to disclose how much funding they're getting. So think tanks, you know, they have this sort of carve out, and there are some difficulties in regulating it. The main one being that there isn't actually a legal term or definition for think tanks. So if you know, if there is some sort of legislation on think tanks, then there's this concern that kind of like that Homer Simpson meme where he goes into the bushes, you know, it's like
Yeah.
some soccer fan and then comes
Sean
out
Spicer disappearing also, yes, yeah.
Exactly. Like there's a concern that think tanks could do that. Oh no, we're not a think tank. We're a research center or something like that. So, you know, there are definitely creative ways to get around that, but I think we mostly want some clarity from the Farah unit about when a think tank should and shouldn't register, because there are, as you mentioned, Farah is very broad. There is certainly some activity that could probably reasonably be considered covered under the Foreign Agents Registration Act. And we even saw last year a case in which a prominent think tanker was indicted by the government for under FARA charges. Sumi Terry, who was in out of a lot of think tanks, Wilson Center, and she, you know, in her case, there was a very explicit kind of quid pro quo where she was going into intelligence or in congressional briefings and providing information immediately after to the Korean intelligence, and you know, literally immediately just going into a car with her handler and giving information. That's a bit of an extreme example, but there are certainly some other cases that we probably just don't know about that are sort of that fall into this other kind of, you know, gray area where we need some more guidance from the FARA unit on. And as to date, there's only been a handful, maybe one or two think tanks that have actually registered under FARA, but it's just sort of, it's not really the ones that you would think. The ones that have, I think, did so under an abundance of caution, in case there was anything that they were worried about.
Wasn't Sumi Terry Max Boot's wife?
Correct.
Yes. And so then you get into the other side of it, which is like, again, you know, we talked about this when it came out like a year or so ago, right? These think tank experts are not only appearing before Congress, they are also helping shape public opinion, right? And that's where I think a lot of the threat is, right? Like public opinion is being shaped by people who are not being identified in the media that's doing the shaping as having their own interests. And of course, you know, husbands and wives are not necessarily like working in cahoots all the time. Maybe Max Boot wrote what he wrote about South Korea because that was his genuine analysis, and he, you know, didn't come as a result of conversations with his wife. But it goes to show how complex and comprehensive the sort of influence system can be, which is why, you know, I do think it is really important to have this information made public and put into a format that people can access really easily. But I I have my personal doubts about the state of our democracy and whether we're at a point where that information can like affect a change or just better illuminate the problem. You know what I mean? So people can more easily say like, here, okay, so here's who's doing the buying. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I would be I would be it would be false advertising if I came on here and said that the think tank funding tracker is going to save democracy.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
I wish, if that turns out to be true,
Yeah.
that's great for the Quincy Institute. That's great for this project. But no, as you say, it's what we're doing here is we want to just illuminate some of these conflicts of interest, um, because as you say, it hasn't existed before now. So.
Mhm. I also want to talk about corporate funding and these Pentagon contractors who are maybe, you could make the case that this is more dangerous than any particular foreign government. And it seems like a lot less regulated. Like at least there is the sort of fig leaf of FARA for foreign lobbyists. But I don't know what at all there exists to indicate when a corporation might be really leaning on, a corporation might be really leaning on a contractor. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that's something that's probably even more prevalent in American media and life and even less understood.
I totally agree. Well, yeah, this is something that hasn't got a lot of attention over the last few years or decades. Foreign funding. There was this big New York Times expose. I think there was another one in, I want to say, Spy magazine a few decades ago. But so it's sort of foreign government funding think tanks kind of pops up every now and then. But there's really not a lot of mention about corporate funding of think tanks. And that corporate money really started entering think tanks in earnest in the 80s, kind of alongside this massive tide of money entering politics, post Watergate and the Reagan era. The Heritage Foundation famously providing a blueprint for the Reagan administration, and so think tanks started really moving from this model that was reliant on government funding, these FFRDCs, federally funded research and development centers, to special interest think tanks, which is what we see today. And we focused on the role of defense contractor funding, uh, and we found a lot there. Northrop Grumman is the largest donor to think tanks in DC, and you can find a direct link of donations to sympathetic policy recommendations. The Atlantic Council last year ran a series of briefs and articles talking about the new ICBM, the Sentinel program, in which they're all very positive, defending the program, which is, tens of billions of dollars over budget. And there's questions about whether we actually even need this program. But amidst all that criticism, the Atlantic Council came out very gung-ho in favor of this program. And most foreign policy think tanks follow a similar pattern where they're receiving funding from not just one or two Pentagon contractors, but most of these major Pentagon contractors: Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, RTX, which formerly known as Raytheon,
Mhm.
uh, Airbus, Mitsubishi. Those were also some major ones. So there's some foreign ones as well, and they all there's a certain window of disagreement, right? You
Mhm.
can have some people who, say we want to increase the Pentagon budget 10%, others that say we want to increase it 5%, or
Mhm.
um, we should invest X amount in the Sentinel program. So there are these disagreements, but the window is just very limited, and so it gives this impression that is where the debate lies, rather than in questioning some of these programs themselves. And
Mhm.
but one of the responses that we've gotten from this project is that it really shines a light on the role of these Pentagon contractors in think tank funding. But what about the other role of corporations in think tank funding? Other sectors, pharmaceutical industry, for instance. And so this is something that we're thinking about, how do we want to expand this project, or how do we want to help other people create a different tracker for other sectors. So it definitely
Cool.
goes beyond just defense contractors and in today's think tank funding model.
I know Ted has a question. I just want to say, I think that's a really pithy way of thinking about how this works is like it directs people to say, this is where the debate is, right? Instead of illuminating the entire space of debate and ideological discussion. Yeah.
Yeah, my question's like about, so this is like financial labeling kind of, right? Like I would love this to be true from personal experience. I would love this to be true about newspapers and media outlets and so on, to know where the money is coming from. But what about like, so when you can never hear the words Heritage Foundation without the prequel, the Conservative Heritage Foundation, or, whatever, the liberal, whatever. Do you think those labels are useful, or do you think they're necessary, or do you think there should be some kind of arbiter to define these things? Because sometimes they're not there, right? Like you'll read in the press, such and such think tank, and it'll sound like, you mentioned the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mm-hmm. It has an ideological orientation. I think we all know what it is, but the average person, like in my hometown of Dayton, Ohio, reads that in the Dayton Daily News. They don't know what it is. It sounds very official and very serious. What do is that something that would be useful to label?
Yeah. Yeah. I remember, I'm 25, and I remember 5-6 years ago when I was kind of getting interested in this world of foreign policy and looking into different think tanks around DC, and there is a certain uniformity to it, right? You hear these very prestigious sounding names, and it becomes, other than those are sort of the two monikers that we hear, is like conservative leaning
Mm-hmm.
or left leaning. That's it. You don't really hear many other descriptors other than that, and it can be very difficult, for someone entering that world to navigate, or just listening to, so it can be
And it's
difficult.
intentional, right? I mean, I
Yes,
get the
yes.
impression that that's not a bug, right? It's a feature.
It's a feature. I think think tanks, they are this sort of nebulous in between, very much because that is where it suits them, because they
Mm-hmm.
want to be, um, they want this veneer of prestige and independence, that comes with these, names after presidents and all these things. So it's it I think, yeah, it's very much a feature, and I think that we probably do need new descriptors, be that, you know I don't know exactly. I'll let all other people decide what that is,
Mm-hmm.
but I will just note that when it comes to foreign policy, these think tanks do all kind of sing in one chorus in favor of larger Pentagon budgets, more conflict abroad, and there aren't many voices at these think tanks that are saying things too differently. And so I think that there is a certain uniformity even amongst left-leaning and right-leaning think tanks, at least in foreign policy on that point.
Mm-hmm. I also feel like we're in a period where, I mean, there's been a lot of discussion of how useful those labels are anymore when it comes to American politics, like sort of left, right, center. They all have their own baggage, right? Like there's the idea that the center is not radical, when I think you can make a lot of very persuasive arguments that what the center seems to want is often the most violent, most radical thing. But some kind of label, yeah, because a lot of it is just sort of, here's the name of the entity, and if you're reading this in an article, it's up to you to go and figure out what that actually is. I don't know if any of you guys have anything else. I was just sort of curious to go back to the foreign funding. It was an interesting list, right? The top funders, it's the UAE, like the UAE by far, and then what? The UK, Canada, Qatar, and Germany? Was that the last one?
That
Was
sounds
there
right.
anything like Did you guys come up with anything that could possibly unite those five countries in why they might be funding U.S. think tanks or what they're getting out of it, or is just sort of a random list?
I would say there were kind of two trends in the foreign donors. There were a lot of NATO allies, going down that list. There were a lot of European countries that certainly have an interest in the U.S. Providing for their defense, and so that was definitely one conclusion that you could kind of parse out. And the other one was a similar thing with Gulf partners. Qatar and the UAE were two of the top three donors, and they not only want the U.S. to, send arms sales, provide for their defense. There's talk of a Saudi security guarantee in the works, uh, but they also really need a to improve their reputation in Washington because unlike many European countries, every now and then you'll hear about human rights issues destabilizing actors in the Emirates, in Saudi Arabia, and so they very much have an interest in improving their reputation. I think that's another motivating factor for their investments in think tanks in DC.
Mhm.
And by the way, I hope I can. I wanted to ask you guys also kind of what you made of this list or this report, kind of what things struck you as you were looking through this, because you have all been in this space for a very long time and have no doubt encountered a lot of uh, been to think tank events, encountered a lot of people in this world. So I'm curious, kind of what stuck out to you guys in reading this report.
I mean, I was surprised at how explicit the not that this is the majority, but how explicit some of the offers of collaboration were. Like really, like that should have tripped some wires when it comes to lobbying. And I saw some comments even, people pointing this out when you posted the stories, people saying this is just lobbying and they should be treated as lobby shops, which is not fair of every think tank, but of the ones that take a lot of funding. And also just like it, I think that it's it illuminated for me again. I mean, I hit this nail all the time, so it's probably boring for John and Ted. But like, there's an institution in the United States that exists to tell people how their world's being shaped, and it is our mass media, right? And so again, it was like that. It's the Quincy Institute itself that has come up with this and is putting it together and saying, hey, New York Times editors and reporters, Washington Post editors and reporters, like maybe you should take this into consideration when you are citing these experts or allowing them. I spent some time trying to find a particular op-ed that raised a bunch of people's hackles last year. I think it was somebody who was it's like talking about why the US needs drone swarms or whatever. And he was an executive at one of the places that's going to be making them, So it's like, this is just a full page advertisement in the Times, basically. And it's not news to me that I think the media is falling down on their job a lot, but it does go to show like how I think the work ahead for actually creating a space for real political debate in the United States. You know what I mean? Again, going back to like who is controlling where the spotlight is on debate. And so I think it is really helpful to have it illustrated here clearly in this tracker. You can see who's funding things and what they might be getting out of it, not to imply that like everybody's doing pay to play, but also shows, I think, how difficult the problem is, right? To sort of expand that spotlight.
Can I just highlight one example that is one of these more explicit kind of pay to play it's from I think the best example of the use of this tracker so far, and this is, speaking of conflicts of interest, is my colleague Kelly Vallejos, the editor at Responsible Statecraft. She wrote an article for Unheard where she highlighted some instances of this, and there was this report from the Center for New American Security in which, as part of the task force for coming out with this report, they had executives from RTX, Lockheed Martin, Palantir, Leidos, and Booz Allen, all of which are donors to the think tank and major Pentagon contractors, all acting as members of the task force, and so they benefit from these proposals and are also quite literally advising and producing analysis for the think tank.
Hmm. Yeah. The other thing is also, I was actually trying to formulate a question about this earlier for myself, and I just thought I don't want this conversation to go really long. But what is interesting to me also is how selective the concern about funding is, right? Like if you are Russian state media right now, you have a label on whatever social media accounts you're still allowed to have. You're treated as like inherently propaganda, and that's all. If you're Chinese media, it's the same. If you're Qatari media, you're Al Jazeera, it's like a
Iranian.
little different.
Yeah.
If you're France 24, on the other hand, I don't think that they've got a label yet. And so it's also like some funding is seen as inherently
Nefarious.
influential and toxic,
Mm-hmm.
and other funding isn't. And it's so interesting to me how, like, you know, sometimes that really matters and sometimes it doesn't. And I was thinking, I think it was DropSite that did a story recently on, it's this media entity whose name I can't pull right now, but it basically, it's an investigative entity that looks into like dark money and shell companies and stuff like that. And they recently ran a report pointing out what's known but isn't really very sort of publicly known, is that this institution is primarily funded by, I think, the U.S. State Department. And so they're writing this story and they're like, look, I mean, this is one of the places that has cooperated to produce the Panama Papers, I think, and the Paradise Papers and a bunch of other like really interesting reporting on dark money and shell companies and whatever. And I guess they wrote to the head of this organization to say like, hey, we're running this story about how you're funded by the U.S. You know, what do you want to say? And he said like, his response was basically one, everybody knows that and it doesn't matter. And two, you're a Russian agent. So
Oh my God.
like, it's so funny how, again, it just goes back to like, some funding is okay and doesn't do any influence at all. And other funding is really nefarious and you can't possibly be saying anything you actually mean if you're taking it. And like, it's just a weird time to exist in.
Yeah, the DropSite story that I think you're talking about, it's about the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project.
That's it. Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it was a really good investigation, and they found that they found that it was like over 50% of their funding came from the State Department. And when you looked at, it's like you said, like, you know, when you looked at which kinds of stories the network was writing about, and a lot of them were good investigations, but the targets were typically U.S. adversaries, and so that kind of shows the politicization, especially of you know, federal funds in that case, but also the politicization of how we interpret these statistics, like this database. You know, there'll be people that say, who cares? You know, most of these are U.S. partners, you know, whether they're Gulf partners or European NATO treaty allies, but you know, it's foreign government funding at the end of the day. They have their own interests, which differ from the United States, and you know, in some cases with, you know, Saudi Arabia, the UAE. I would argue the Quincy Institute. A lot of people at the Quincy Institute argue have gotten us into military entanglements abroad, and it could be a cause for concern that these are some of the largest donors. So there is very much a select politicization of this funding. And a lot of it depends on your own views, right? So
yeah. I don't want to keep you for too long, so unless you guys have anything else, I think we'll let you go. I do want to say if you do another tracker on like the pharmaceutical industry or something, that I'll be very interested in that. That would be very cool.
Sweet, I'll let you know.
All right.
Thank you guys so much. This has been amazing. Really
Thanks
appreciate
so
it.
much.
Thank you.
That
So
was
much fun. Good
Nick
work.
Cleveland-Stout from the Quincy Institute. I don't know if you want to tell people where they can follow you on Twitter or anything.
Sure. Yeah, follow me on Twitter. I think it's Nick_Clevelands is my handle. But more importantly, please check out the Think Tank Funding Tracker and reach out to me either over Twitter or email. Let me know what you find with this, because again, I really want this to be a resource that people just kind of explore for themselves, come to their own conclusions, and check out our report on the Quincy Institute website. So thank you guys so much.
Thanks, Nick.
Thank you.
See ya.
Take care.
See ya.
Bye.